Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and young ladies and young gentlemen. You're all very welcome for this very special celebration of a much-loved family film, Swallows and Amazons, 50 years ago. And a little bit later, we'll be reuniting 4 swallows and 1 Amazon to hear about their memories and reminiscences of filming for 7 weeks in the Lake District. But first of all, I want to introduce you to the man without whom there would have been no script for this film. And he is a particular friend of mine because we both happen to share an interest in the craft or art of magic. He's an actor as well, and an author, and a composer, and a director, and a producer. In 1968, he co-starred with Malcolm McDowell in a film called If, which some of the grown-ups here will know. And he was reunited with one of his co-stars, Malcolm McDowell, a few years later in Aces High, along with other almost unknowns like John Gielgud, Trevor Howard, Christopher Plummer, Ray Milland, and so on. But his greatest claim to fame, I guess, is the extraordinary work which he's done over the years as a playwright. He has dramatised, I think it's fair to say, more theatre for young people than anybody else. You may have heard or seen some of his shows, like The Gingerbread Man, The Owl and the Pussycat Went to Sea, S-E-E, The Selfish Shellfish, The Seesaw Tree, and The Plotters of Cabbage Patch Corner. His stage adaptations are really legendary. He dramatised Dick King-Smith's Babe, The Sheep Pig, and I'd say pretty much every sign, this is not true, pretty much every story by Roald Dahl. Certainly the BFG, The Witches, The Twits, James and the Giant Peach, Fantastic Mr. Fox, Danny Champion of the World, and George's Marvellous Medicine. So that gives you an idea. Other successful adaptations have included Helen Nichols' Meg and Mog show, some of you will know that, I'm sure, Philippa Pierce's Tom's Midnight Garden, and perennially, it seems, Judith Kerr's The Tiger Who Came to Tea. Anybody seen that? Any young people here seen it? Yeah? Well, nobody's owning up, David. No wonder the Times theatre critic, Irving Wardle, referred to him as the national children's dramatist. In 2007, he won the J.M. Barrie Award as Children's Arts Literature Achievement. And, oh yes, in 1974, he wrote the screenplay for the 1974 film Arthur Ransome's Swallows and Amazons. Please welcome David Wood, OBE. Hi.
Up and a half.
Well, okay. Which bit should I have left out? I mean, I didn't mention that you also wrote a play called The Queen's Handbag, which was performed in the back garden at Buckingham Palace, for example.
Yes, that was quite fun. That was 7 months of my life. I nearly had a nervous breakdown.
Was that payment for having been awarded the OBE a few years before?
No, I don't think Her Majesty remembered, but it was the Queen's 80th, and she decided to have a party for children in the back. And the BBC said, let's do a play with lots of starry names, and we'll take all the iconic characters from British children's literature and put them together in one play, and that was what I had to do.
Right.
No, I won't talk any more about that.
Well, you can ask him later if you want to know more. How he's hobnobbing with royalty. I should also mention that amongst the cast here today is Sophie Neville, whose book, The Making of Swallows and Amazon, as my copy, and there are other copies here which I know will be available afterwards from Sophie to sign for you. So anything you want to know, it's there. And without Sophie's book, I couldn't have been conducting this session today. So let's start right at the beginning. Did you read Arthur Ransome when you were a young boy?
No.
Oh dear. But you knew the books, didn't you? Or you knew of the books?
Yes, my cousin Richard was a year older than me, and he had all the books on his shelf in the 50s. And I always thought that they were too old for me, and as the years went by, I was always too old for them, so I never read them. And it wasn't until a lovely man called Neville Thompson, who had worked on the production side of If, he got in touch and said, could we meet? Have you read Swallow? And I was honest, I said no. He said, we're looking for somebody to do a screenplay, and as a result of that, I did read the book. I liked it very much. I felt I was totally ill-equipped because I'd never been in a sailing boat. I didn't like the idea of going on a sailing boat. I knew nothing about sailing whatsoever. But I did admire hugely the book, and I thought that it was one of the things that I was learning then, because other things that I've done since, like Tom's Midnight Garden you mentioned, I did the stage version of Goodnight Mr. Tom, and what I always try to do is to look at it from the children's point of view, rather than the adult point of view, which it probably sounds easier than it is, but with this I thought that's the way to do it, and that's the way in. And in fact Ransome gives us a story which is very much from the children's point of view. So I went off and I gutted the book, and I wanted to be very faithful to the book, and I came up with a synopsis, and that was, if you want me to talk about Mrs. Ransome.
Well, yes, we will. But just before that, I just want to catch up on that point that you said about you decided you wanted to be very faithful to it. I was very struck in reading something you'd written about the writing of the film when you said, and I quote, you said that it was really important. My aim, you said, was to be faithful to the book. You just said it then. And why not, you added. I was aware that I'd often seen films that took huge liberties with the source material of a book, and I didn't want to follow that example. So tell me about this, because it's something I think it's a view we both share, that if you're going to present something in a different medium, you need to have some respect for the property to start with.
Well, I've never understood why, when you read a book and you like it, and then they say they're going to make a film of it, and you go to see it, and it's not what you've read at all. And it's as though the idea of buying the rights to something and having a title, which is a big title, and therefore people will come in, is an excuse in some way to do what you want, or what the producer. I've never understood that. And if a story is a good story, yes, a book is very different from a play or a film. Therefore, there are going to be differences. There are going to be things that are not there. There are going to be things that have been added. That's bound to happen. But you've got to be faithful to what was there in the first place, and that's certainly what we tried to do. And Claude Whatham, who directed the film, he very much wanted that as well, which was fortunate. So we didn't have any rows about all that. No, he wanted it to be. He wanted to see the children doing things. That was the phrase that he said. And so when I was rewriting, I was putting in all sorts of things, of them making the campfire, of them putting up a tent, of them gutting a fish or going fishing. Those things to him were very important. We must see them doing it. And of course, all credit to the cast who were actually sailing in those boats, quite apart from the fact they had no life jackets because there was no health and safety in those days. But they were actually doing it for real, and I think that was important, and that was why the casting was so important, because they had to find a team that would not only get on with each other, but actually could do what was asked of them in difficult conditions, because it poured with rain in the Lake District a lot of the time. They had to go swimming. I think there was one horrible day when they went swimming in freezing cold water. But they all did these things on screen, which was very important to Claude, and I think adds very much to the flavour of the film.
I agree. So let's just go back to the point where you are now told you need to go up and visit, or go down and visit Mrs. Ransome. Now, she was a daunting character. Tell me a little bit about Mrs. Ransome.
Yeah, Mrs. Ransome lived in a retirement village in Banbury, and I didn't know that much about her at the time, but I did know that she'd been Trotsky's secretary and had escaped with Ransome during the beginning of the Russian Revolution. So she was obviously a formidable lady, and she was too. And she was very formal in her greeting, and she talked a bit about the books, but not that much. But this was really just to see whether she thought I was suitable to do the job. And she gave me permission to do the job, which was very kind, and I did. Then it was decided that maybe Mrs. Ransome should be invited to the Lake District, having read my first draft script, and we could have a chat about it. And the idea was that she would be able to visit some of the locations from the original story, which everybody thought that she would like to do. Well, indeed, this was a revelation, because she was quite slow moving. She was quite elderly. But the moment there was a little boat there, she skipped into it, almost like a gazelle, and sat there eagle-eyed. And we went over to Peel Island, or Wildcat Island, and she skipped out, and she went round and she was pointing and saying, oh, there's the landing lights there, and that's where this happened, and that's where that happened. And she obviously had a wonderful time. We were then put into a small room in the hotel, just the two of us, to talk about my script. Terrified, I didn't know what she was going to say. And she said, this line, pointing to the line in the script, you have given to Susan. Susan would never say that line. And luckily, I had a copy of the book, and I was able to go through the book and find it and say, actually, your husband did give Susan this line. And she looked at me, slightly old-fashioned look, and she said, I think it will be all right. End of meeting. That was that. And as far as I know, she did enjoy the film, although she didn't let us do any more. Right. I mean, I wrote a whole script of Great Northern, but she didn't want that done. And
others too.
And yeah, I did a 6-part serial of We Didn't Mean to Go to Sea. That was never done. I did Pigeon Post as a serial. That was never done. I never got paid a penny either. But no, it was worth it to have done this one.
She did have a bit of advice on your first meeting, though, didn't she? I mean, she told you things like the children had to wear a certain item of clothing.
Well, something was very odd, because she did say the children all had to be blonde with blue eyes, and I decided to ignore that. I didn't tell the producers she said that. And she did talk about Airtex shirts.
Yes.
I remember.
Right.
She wrote about that. But no, she pointed to a chest which was on a half landing. And I don't know why she did this, because I didn't ask about it. She said, in that chest is my husband's autobiography. It will never be published in my lifetime. And of course I was fascinated to know why not, but I couldn't ask her why not. When it did come out after she died, all I could discover really was that there was quite a lot about Ransome's first wife, which maybe she objected to. But no, feisty, it's a good word. Yeah. Good word.
Did you gain any kind of insight into their relationship? I think she talked to you a bit about their lives in the Lake District, didn't she?
Well, no, she obviously loved all that, but I think he went off and did things on his own quite a lot. And there was a story where he went off, I think with Quilla Cooch, the critic, and they went up to Scotland fishing, and she was left on her own in the Lake District for weeks on end, and there was no communication, of course, in those days, really, except that occasionally there would be the clop of a horse coming along the lane, and a cart, and a delivery would be made of a salmon, which had arrived on the train, and that was about it. And I always felt that was why she didn't want Great Northern done, because I thought, well, maybe she hated Scotland because he was away there so much. I don't know. Who knows? But
how easy did you find once you'd got the approach to the script? How easy was it, the process of adapting?
I mean, it was fine, really. Somebody asked me at the Arthur Ransome Society thing I talked at, why I changed the beginning, and I said, well, I didn't change the beginning. I actually gave it a little extra at the beginning to try and set the whole thing up. I mean, the Roger tacking up the field is how it begins, which is wonderful. But I thought we needed to know who this family was, the fact that they were coming from somewhere to the Lake District, and so I did it very simple. I just put them on a train, And they had a little conversation, and you learnt during that various things, including the fact that the mother was originally Australian. I don't know quite why I thought that was important, but I thought it was interesting. And of course Virginia McKenna, who was lovely as the mother, played all that beautifully. And it meant that by the time we got up there, they were able to run out of the car straight away down and look out, and they could see the island, and that was sort of into opening credits almost.
I think it's a really clever move, because it first of all establishes the fact that we are with the children going on an adventure, a journey, and nostalgically to people of a certain age, certainly who would have been watching the film, it brought back memories of going on holiday, the train journey to get where you were going. And I think it also puts the place where the adventure happens in somewhere else. You know, you have that, I mean, you have it in the Railway Children as well, of course, where they're not in their natural comfort zone, and that's important for the story.
Well, also, you get the thing which all the classic children's writers do, which is to get rid of the parents.
Absolutely.
As soon as you possibly can. Roald Dahl normally kills them off on page 2, killed by a rhinoceros, as in James and the Giant Peach. But no, in Ransome's case, it was more subtle than that, because the father was a sea captain, so he was away working. And Mother, I mean, I always got the feeling that Mother probably did a bit of writing or something. But she was certainly liberal enough to allow them to go off on these adventures on their own, which is, of course, the whole point.
Yeah, exactly. And I would have thought at the time, maybe it was at the time okay when Ransome was writing it, that would have been acceptable for having children running off and doing things. Wouldn't happen now, of course.
No.
Unsupervised, would be very unlikely.
No, absolutely. No, I imagine it was. And also, there is the fantasy element. I mean, he is imagining what would happen if.
Yes.
But at the same time, I don't think there would have been any concerns about life jackets or children going off on their own in a boat. No, not at all.
And of course, you were talking about the difficulty of communication back then when Ransome was alive. But that's also a key element of the stories, in a way. As with Blyton, there are no mobile phones. You know, if you go to an island and there are smugglers or pirates, you've got to deal with it yourselves, because there's no good ringing for help.
Yeah, well, I certainly think the writing of a story now it's very different. I mean, you have to take those things into account. And if you see, I mean, any crime drama on television or something now, I mean, it's all to do with mobile phones, isn't it? They're all, the whole time they're waiting for the phone to ring, this and that. So it has changed the nature of the process completely, and indeed storytelling itself.
You've talked about Neville Thompson, but the other person who was very involved in the early stages was Richard Pilbrow. Tell me something about Richard Pilbrow.
Yeah, Richard was a lovely man who I knew as a theatre producer.
Expert on lighting as well, wasn't he?
Well, he was the world expert on lighting. I had first met him when I was 18 or something. I was on my way to university, and I was an extra at Chichester Festival Theatre in its second season, and Richard was lighting all the plays, and Olivier had picked him to do this huge, really, lighting job, not just for Chichester, but what nobody knew was that the National Theatre was coming. Olivier was going to be doing it, and he wanted to assemble his team, and Richard became that. And his book on the craft of lighting, I mean, very difficult to understand technically, but brilliant. And he's got a new one. Sadly, he died last year. But his new book about the history of the National Theatre from the point of view of the technical side is apparently extraordinary. But he produced Charlie's Aunt in the West End, and my Owl Pussycat Went to Sea was asked if it could go in on top of it at the Apollo Theatre. Which was the first time I think I'd had a play in a West End theatre. And it wasn't easy at all, but we did it. And so I got to know him. And I used to go into the office sometimes, and then Neville worked for him, and that's how...
When you say on top of it, you mean...
Well, Charlie's Aunt would be on in the evening, and we'd be on in the morning and afternoon.
Okay.
And it's a very small stage. There's very little wing space. Charlie's Aunt has 3 sets. We had quite a bit as well, and it was tricky, but they were very magnanimous in letting us do it. And they actually, in those days, children's theatre was very much in the 3rd division. The idea of having a children's play in the West End was unheard of, really. So I was very grateful for that. That was in the very early 70s, and a year or two before 73, which is when Swallows and Amazons was written and indeed filmed.
Children's theatre now has a different appreciation, do you feel?
It's still...
I mean, you mentioned Tom, Goodnight Mr. Tom. You won an Olivier for that.
Yes, I was very, very grateful. That was a labour of love. I mean, it was a book that I'd wanted to adapt for 12 years but hadn't been able to get the rights. But no, that's for older children too. What has really happened now is that theatre for under 5s, which didn't exist 40 years ago, that has become very, very important, and there's a lot of it. And my Tiger Who Came to Tea, which still astounds me, is 16 years old. I've been directing it every year for 16 years. Now we do 2 productions a year. It just keeps going. And the audience, of course, changes very rapidly. New children of that age come along. And that's lovely. And people seem to accept it, and theatres seem to accept it now as an integral part of their programming.
That's great.
And that's new, and that's exciting.
You've already mentioned the director of Swallows and Amazons, Claude Whatham, but it was originally Peter Hammond who was going to direct, and Peter Hammond was a distinguished producer. He'd worked on Inspector Morse, Armchair Theatre, lots and lots of things, the film Hereward the Wake. What happened in that transition? But for you, it was quite a lucky transition, wasn't it?
Peter was a nice man. I mean, I only met him once, and we all went up, Richard, Neville, and Peter and I went up and stayed in the Lake District for 2 or 3 nights, and we took a boat and we went looking at locations and so on. And the thing I most remember, which is silly really, but we went past Bowness, which is Rio in the film, in the book, and on the bank of the lake there was this sort of Edwardian bandstand. And I saw that, and I remember writing it down, thinking, "Oh, I wonder if I could have a band." You know, and they gave me. We got a real brass band playing.
Look for the scene. Look for the scene when it comes up.
It was very exciting. But he departed, and I don't know why. I don't know what happened. And Claude came on the scene. And what was extraordinary when I was told that Claude was considering it and then accepted it, was that I had worked with Claude as an actor in the original production of Voyage Round My Father, the John Mortimer play, at Greenwich. And in fact, I think I'm the only person ever to have worked with Claude as a screenplay writer, as an actor, and also a film actor, very briefly in a film called Sweet William, and on television. And Susanna Hamilton, Susan in the film, was in Disraeli, in which I played, I think, Foreign Secretary or something, I'm not quite sure. And so I knew Claude well, and this was good. And he used to come round to the house, and we used to go through the script in minute detail. And he would say, "Oh, I suggest that, I suggest that." And so he was very much part of it. And he always needed to be doing something, Claude. And I had a brass standard lamp thing. And he polished it most beautifully over a period of 2 or 3 days. He'd sit there and talking at the same time. But useful guy to have around. Yeah,
a few odd jobs while he's there.
He did a great job. I mean, the children will tell you later on, perhaps the way he worked. From my point of view, it was quite different because, as far as I know, they didn't have scripts. The children were not given scripts, but he fed lines to them, and sometimes if they came up with a line which was better than mine, so be it. And it was an evolving, almost an improvised process to a certain extent, except that he knew exactly what he wanted and worked hard to get it. But I think he was rather extraordinary, I have to say.
And you didn't have any resentments about that when you saw the finished version and thought, hang on, they're not reading my script?
No, I didn't. I probably didn't notice even.
I doubt that, actually.
No.
But as an actor, of course, you also understand that there are times when the actor actually does know best.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it was a script that was meant to evolve, and sometimes if the weather was different from in the scene, obviously you had to adjust to that.
Of course, and the weather was.
Indeed.
Very much so. Tell me about EMI and how they came to be in the project, because without them, the film would never have got released.
Yeah, well...
Or wouldn't have had as big a release,
I think it was Bernard Delfont, who one has to thank in many ways. Bernard Delfont, apart from all his theatre stuff, he headed up EMI Films. And of course the Railway Children happened, and he was very much in favour of family films, and he was almost alone in that at the time in this country. So the money, a lot of the money came from EMI, which was very exciting. My stepfather had worked for EMI in the classical record division, so I was very pleased about that. But Nat Cohen, who was the executive who was put in charge of the film, we never felt that he was behind it really at all. He didn't appear very often, and he was a bit dismissive when he did, and I honestly think that the distribution of the film could have been better organised if he had been a bit more behind it.
Right.
But it's a long time ago now, but at least it was made. That was pretty remarkable, and it was my first effort at a screenplay, and you heard of these people who'd written 15 screenplays and never got one on. So I was very, very, very lucky.
Well, you had your own problems in getting things on afterwards, so, but nice to have had that initial boost. You didn't get to go to, I think once you were on location, but you were otherwise engaged in a play because you were earning your legitimate living at the time.
Yes, I was offered a play at Greenwich Theatre, and I decided I wanted to do it. Looking back, I wish I hadn't done it really, but that meant that I couldn't be on the location much. But at the same time, there was something at the back of my mind which felt that I would be, too many cooks. Yeah. I felt that Claude needed and if I was there all the time, and if he was turning around saying, "Is that all right? Can we do that?" That would have been wrong. Yeah. So I didn't feel that I'd made the wrong decision from that point of view.
Yes, but it would have been nice to have had the experience, obviously.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you missed the premiere as well.
Yeah,
that's pretty awful.
I was in a show in Manchester. I couldn't get down for the premiere.
The understudy have taken over for just one night?
Yeah, shame. No, I think my mother and my stepfather went and enjoyed themselves.
Right. How was it received? Because now we think of it as a much-loved film, but the reviews were kind of mixed. There was very kind of responses.
Oh, very mixed, yes. But there were some very nice ones, and there were some which were very patronising and, sniffy about it being a children's film and so on. And the examples, I wrote an article for the Arthur Ransome Society recently, and I found some very contrasting reviews, which were fascinating, really. But I think it was not a runaway huge hit, put it that way. But what has been extraordinary over the years is that you see it on BBC television, and they call it a classic, children's classic. Now, whether they're referring to the book or the film, who knows? But
I think both, actually.
Well, I would like to think that, and the fact that we're here is very exciting. Yeah. This reunion that's taking place of the Swallows and one Amazon after all these years is lovely, and the fact that the film is remembered, and that is in spite of the fact that there has been another version since, but this one does still seem to cut the mustard, as they say.
You were talking about the films that you didn't get to make to do with Ransome, but you did return to Swallows and Amazons.
Well, yes, I had a phone call about, 25 years, 30 years after I'd done the screenplay, from a radio producer who said they were doing a radio production for Radio 4, and would I be interested in writing the script? And something in my head told me, don't mention the film. And then I thought, well, hang on, maybe they're asking you because of the film. And I thought, well, no, I won't mention the film yet. And so I didn't. And in fact, we went through the whole process of the Radio 4 recording and everything without ever mentioning this fact, and I still don't know whether Catherine, who was the producer, did realise. But it was quite useful having written the thing, although I did learn that writing a play for radio is very different from writing a film script. And one of the things was, I suddenly thought, I've got 6 children with unbroken voices on radio. How on earth do you distinguish between 6 of them? And in the end, I did have one idea, which was that the Amazons live in the Lake District. I thought it's quite likely, actually, that they go to quite posh private schools down south, for all we know, but why don't we give them northern accents? And then at least that will distinguish them from the swallows. So we did that. Right. No, it was lovely. It was lovely to revisit it.
Well, we're going to meet those swallows and one Amazon very shortly, so that's yet to come. But just in kind of wrapping up, you touched on a lot of things, but this whole concept about family films, do you think, how is it now, do you feel? Because I mean, at the time this film was being made, there was the Children's Film Foundation and the Children's Film Unit, both making regular productions of all kinds, Children's Film Unit with all kinds of stars and people taking part. But it was always seen as something like almost a ghetto, that's for the children, and if you can get some big stars, well, that's lovely. But do you think it's changed? Is there anybody really doing stuff that's for children now, or is family films now just big adventure epics and things?
Well, I think that is true, but I think that there are a tremendous number of films now, not just from America either, that are fantasy-based, which therefore lean towards being for children, even though the word family comes in, and in fact it is a very wide age range.
Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, that kind of thing.
But they are there, and I do think that Disney led the way in one sense of making people realise that the widest common denominator gave films shelf life. If you do focus in on one particular, maybe it's not going to be as successful, and therefore it won't stand the test of time. I don't know. I don't know. I would like to think that children, family, adult, that there is more connection between the three than there was perhaps 50 years ago, when you actually had to say, this is a film for the family and it's being made with the same production values as we might make a film for grown-ups. I would like to think that.
Well, the one thing we all have in common is that if we're grown-ups, we were once children, and if we are children, we will one day become grown-ups. So, you know, that reliving of childhood, I think, is also an important part of the legacy of these films.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. If you could have done one of the other projects that you didn't do, I mean, in film terms, which would it have been?
We didn't mean to go to sea, I think, is a brilliant adventure story, which is terribly real. I mean, you know, you can find sort of fantasy elements in some of the other books, but that one you can actually imagine happening, I think. So I would have liked to do that, but if I'm honest, Great Northern was a project which we spent a lot of time on and quite a lot of money on, and I had the most wonderful time. We got a helicopter from Inverness and we flew over Loch Ness at about, I don't know, 15 feet or something, and we went to all these islands like Harris and Lewis looking for possible locations, which was the most wonderful 2 days. And Peter Sellers was lined up, hopefully, to play Gemmerling, who was the nasty bird's egg collector. And so it had all the elements, you know. I thought, oh, that would be great. And it never happened, but they were.
Well, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, David Wood. Just for a minute. And David will be back afterwards with the cast, and so if you've got Q&As, anything you'd like to ask David, you can do so then. He's covered so much already, but well done, thank you. I'd now like to invite Sophie Neville, if she would, to come up for us and just read us a very special message that we've received from Virginia McKenna, who can't be here today. Where are you, Sophie?
Here I am.
Ah, you're there.
This is a message from Dame Virginia McKenna. She wrote, "It's almost impossible to believe that it's the 50th anniversary of Swallows and Amazons. I am really sorry I cannot be with you, but I'm here in spirit. For anyone who feels downhearted by the troubles in our present-day world, there can be no better cure than to be here this afternoon watching this delightful film set in such beautiful scenery. In a few moments, you'll be transported to an earlier time and a different place. You cannot but enjoy this very special film."
Lovely, thank you. Thank you, Sophie. I just wanted to, since that was Titty speaking to us there, when you came to do the radio version, I should have asked you this at the moment when we were talking about it, the prospect of a character being called Titty was a bit of a problem, wasn't it?
Oh yes, I was told very forcefully you can't have a character called Titty, and I said, but that's her name. And they said, no, call her Kitty. That would be much more appropriate. So I said, no, I don't think so. And I thought about it. And I thought the way to approach this is to have a narrator who introduces the story and maybe links certain parts of the story, who is the elderly Titty, the Titty of today. And that fitted because Titty is the imaginative one, is the creative one. And so I wrote it like that, and these producers said, oh yes, that's fine. They said, who do you want to play older Titty? And the only person I could think of who could ever play it for me was Jean Anderson. You remember Jean Anderson of Tenko and the Brothers? And she'd been also in a adaptation I did for television of Back Home, which was another Michel Magorian novel. And she was in her 90s, but she said yes straight away. And she arrived in Soho, and she went down the steps into the cellar quite happily. And they told her, if we could finish your contribution, in time, Miss Anderson, we could all go for a very nice lunch. And she said, oh, yes, what a good idea. And of course, she was brilliant. She finished it in time for 11s, let alone lunch. But, yeah.
Thank you, David. Well, as Virginia McKenna was saying, you are about to be transported to another place and another time. Later on, we'll be able to talk with Titty and the other Walker children, John, Susan and Roger, and Nancy Blackett, or rather their real-life alter egos. But now it's time for all of us to watch Swallows and Amazon.